My heart just sank when I saw all these different money orders.
I was supposed to get $1.2 million from this.
Betty is 80 years old. She lives alone. She cooks her own meals. She pays her own bills. She pinched pennies her entire adult life. And in 1 year, she sent $35,000 to people who told her she had won $1.2 million. Betty's daughter found her at the post office. Betty was holding an envelope. Inside that envelope, $2,500 worth of money orders. The envelope was addressed to a man named Michael Ritchie in Florida. Betty had been told he was a federal agent overseeing the release of her sweepstakes winnings. He wasn't. Michael Ritchie was an elderly man in Margate, Florida, another victim of the exact same scam, chasing the exact same prize.
You're still going to keep doing sweepstakes?
I don't know. I put a lot of money in it now.
He had lost $70,000 over 3 years. And even after everything, he still wasn't sure it was fake. This is how sweepstakes fraud works. It doesn't just steal money. It steals reality. On Love or Lie, we break down the mechanics of scams like this, and not to scare you, but so you can recognize the warning signs before someone you love gets caught. If that sounds worth your time, stick with me. Betty Bradam is 80 years old. She lives independently. That word matters, independently. She doesn't need help. She cooks her own meals. She cleans her own house. She handles her own finances. She's done this her entire adult life. Her daughter, Debbie Lynch, describes her as someone who pinched pennies. Not because she had to, because that's who Betty is. Careful, responsible. Someone who doesn't waste money on frivolous things.
It makes me so sad.
At 80, most people are slowing down. Betty wasn't. She was still sharp, still capable, still handling the details of her own life without assistance. That independence is important to her. It's her identity. It's proof that age hasn't taken anything from her. And then a letter arrived. A notification. Official looking. It said she had won $1.2 million in a sweepstakes she didn't remember entering.
I was supposed to get $1.2 million from this sweepstakes I entered.
But the letter explained that it said she'd entered in May. It listed a contact, a federal agent who was overseeing the distribution of her winnings. Betty didn't think it was strange. Why would she? The letter looked legitimate. It had official language. It referenced law enforcement oversight. And most importantly, it told her she had won. For someone who had pinched pennies her entire life, $1.2 million wasn't abstract. It was freedom. It was security. It was the ability to help her daughter, maybe her grandchildren. It was a lifetime of careful decisions finally paying off. So when the letter said she needed to pay a small processing fee to release the funds, Betty didn't hesitate. She went to the bank. The letter was the first hook, but the calls were what locked her in. Betty received multiple phone calls from people who identified themselves as federal agents. They knew details. They had paperwork. They had tracking numbers. They spoke with authority. One of them was a man named Michael Ritchie. Except Michael Ritchie wasn't a federal agent. Michael Ritchie was a 68-year-old man in Margate, Florida, who had also been told he'd won a sweepstakes. The scammers were using him as a middleman, having Betty send money orders to him, which he would then forward to the real criminals, usually in Costa Rica.
He just sent $3,000 in postal money orders, and a few days later she sends another $2,500.
Michael didn't know he was being used. He thought he was helping facilitate Betty's winnings, because he was also waiting for his own. This is layered fraud. The scammers don't just trick one person, they trick multiple people simultaneously, using each victim to validate the others. If Betty questioned whether this was real, she could look at the paperwork. She could see Michael Ritchie's name, a real person with a real address in Florida. That made it feel legitimate. The instructions were clear. To release the $1.2 million, Betty needed to pay a series of small fees, taxes, processing fees, security deposits. Each payment unlocked the next step. The amount started small, a few $100s, then $1,000, then $1,500. Betty went to her bank. She withdrew cash. She bought money orders. She mailed them to Michael Ritchie, who forwarded them to Costa Rica. Then came another call, another fee, another reason. And Betty, who had spent 80 years being responsible with money, kept paying. Because in the framework of winning $1.2 million, a few $1,000s felt reasonable. It felt like the cost of doing business. Her daughter didn't know, Betty didn't tell her, because Betty didn't think anything was wrong. $35,000, that's how much Betty sent over the course of 1 year. Not in a single transaction, not in one moment of confusion. $1,000 here, $1,500 there, $2,500 in that envelope her daughter found.
My heart just sank when I saw all these different money orders.
Betty went to different bank branches. She withdrew money in chunks, small enough that it didn't trigger alarms. She bought money orders because the scammers told her to. Money orders are harder to trace than checks, harder to reverse than wire transfers. This is engineered extraction. The scammers knew exactly how much to ask for at each step. Too much, and Betty might balk. Too little, and they're leaving money on the table. They calibrated the request to stay just below her threshold of suspicion. Each payment created more investment. If you've already sent $5,000, the idea that you're about to receive $1.2 million feels more real, not less. Because the alternative, admitting you made a mistake, becomes psychologically unbearable. The brain doesn't want to process loss. It wants to believe in the win. Especially when the win has been dangled in front of you for months. Betty wasn't stupid. Betty was caught in a cognitive trap that is professionally designed to exploit how human beings make decisions under uncertainty. And here's the part that makes it worse. During our interview with Betty, while the cameras were still rolling, a man called her phone. He identified himself as a federal agent. He asked about the $2,500 she was supposed to mail. The scam was still active. Even after her daughter had found the money orders. Even after Betty had been told this was fraud. The scammers were still calling, still pressuring, still trying to extract more. Betty's daughter had to intervene on the call, had to physically take the phone and tell the man to stop calling.
Just a minute, let me ask my daughter about this. Wants me to send $2,500 to get my package.
Meanwhile, in Florida, Michael Ritchie, the man Betty had been sending money to, was still convinced the sweepstakes was real. When reporters asked him if he was going to keep participating, he said, "I don't know. I put a lot of money in it now."
You're still going to keep doing sweepstakes.
I don't know. I put a lot of money in it now.
Michael had lost $70,000 over 3 years. He had wired thousands of his own savings to Costa Rica. He had forwarded money orders from people like Betty. And he still wasn't sure it was fake. That's the power of these scams. They don't just take money. They take your ability to see what's real. Real quick, if you're watching this and thinking about your mom, your grandmother, someone you know who might get one of these calls, that's exactly why Love or Lie exists. I'm Jack. We don't just report these stories. We break them down so you can recognize the patterns before someone you love loses everything. Hit subscribe. Share this with one person who needs to see it. All right, let me tell you what happened to Betty after the camera left. $35,000 is not abstract. For Betty, $35,000 was years of careful savings. It was the money she had set aside for emergencies, for medical expenses, for the unexpected costs of aging, gone. But the financial loss isn't the whole story. The psychological damage is harder to measure. Betty's daughter described her as someone who had always been independent. Someone who handled her own life. And now, Debbie had to step in, had to monitor her mother's bank accounts, had to intervene on phone calls. Betty's independence, the thing she had worked so hard to maintain, was eroded by this scam. And the shame. Betty didn't tell her daughter what was happening. She hid the withdrawals. She went to different bank branches so no one would notice the pattern. She kept it secret because admitting she had been tricked felt worse than continuing to believe the lie. This is what sweepstakes fraud does. It isolates victims. It creates a feedback loop where the shame of being scammed becomes the reason you can't stop being scammed. Sean Cadigan, a general magistrate in Tallahassee who handles guardianship cases involving seniors, sees this pattern constantly. He describes the scammers as slick. They know what they're doing. They know how to build trust. They know how to create dependency. And they know how to target the exact demographic most vulnerable to this kind of manipulation: older adults who live independently, who handle their own finances, who don't have the constant oversight from family members.
People are slick that are calling, and they know what they're doing, and they know how to hook them. They know how to get that person comfortable with them.
Betty is still processing what happened. Her daughter is still trying to figure out how to protect her mother without stripping away her autonomy. The scammers? They moved on to the next call. Betty's story is not isolated. Sweepstakes fraud is one of the most common scams targeting older Americans right now. It brings in millions of dollars annually. And it works because it exploits something fundamental about human psychology, the desire to believe good news. When someone tells you that you've won money, your brain doesn't immediately go to, this is a scam. Your brain goes to, what will I do with the money? You start planning. You start imagining the future. And every small payment you make to unlock the prize reinforces the belief that it's real. Michael Ritchie, the man in Florida who Betty was sending money to, lost $70,000 over 3 years. When reporters asked him if he was going to keep participating in sweepstakes, he said, I don't know. I put a lot of money in it now. That sentence tells you everything. He's not saying, yes, I believe it's real. He's saying, I've invested too much to walk away. That's the sunk cost fallacy. And it's one of the most powerful psychological tools scammers use. Experts recommend 3 things to protect older loved ones. First, have conversations about this type of fraud before it approaches them. Talk about how these scams work. Make it normal to discuss. Remove the stigma. Second, ask about viewing only access to their bank accounts. Not control, just visibility. So you can spot unusual withdrawals before they spiral. Third, if you suspect abuse, call the state hotline. In Florida, it's 1-896-ABUSE. Every state has one. The institutions that should be protecting people, banks, phone companies, law enforcement, are not moving fast enough. Banks don't flag unusual patterns of money order purchases. Phone companies don't block spoofed numbers claiming to be federal agents. The responsibility falls on families, on individuals, on communities. Because the scammers are getting better. They're more organized. They're using more sophisticated techniques, like layering victims so one victim validates another. And they're not slowing down. Betty Bradam is 80 years old, she lives independently, she cooks her own meals, she pays her own bills, and for 1 year, she believed she had won $1.2 million. She didn't lose $35,000 because she was careless. She lost it because someone built a lie so convincing that even after her daughter found the money orders, even after reporters explained it was fraud, even after everything, the scammers were still calling. And Betty still wasn't sure. That's not stupidity, that's professional manipulation. The only defense against this is knowing what these scams look like before they land in your mailbox. Before the call comes. Before the letter arrives. That's what we do here on Love or Lie. I'm Jack. If this story made you think about someone you love, if it made you want to check in, ask questions, just make sure they're okay, then it did what it was supposed to do. There's another story coming next week. It's harder to believe than this one. I'll see you then.